Thank you, Andy. Before we dive into the meat of the presentation, I just want to give just a quick introduction of the Central California Rural Regional Energy Network. Many of you are probably familiar with regional energy networks. Essentially, we exist to provide energy efficiency programs and services with funding through the California Public Utilities Commission. And RENs are very much focused on serving their communities. Our regional energy network, you can go ahead to the next slide, Andy. We were approved in September of last year, and there are a number of us organizations that are involved, and we are delivering 6 programs, primarily designed for hard-to-reach customers and disadvantaged and underserved communities. Our 6 programs include a residential and workforce education program, commercial energy improvement, a public agency program, and codes and standards. Codes and standards is what brings us all here today. This training is part of this program. And then we also have a finance program slated to launch in 2026. So just a little bit about the organizations behind the Central California Rural REN, or CCR REN for short. Our organization, High Sierra Energy Foundation, exists in the Eastern Sierra, so we serve Mono and Inyo counties. The CCR REN is administered by the County of San Luis Obispo, and the County of Ventura serves as an advisory role. And then in the Central Valley, our partner, San Joaquin Valley Clean Energy Organization, serves the 8 counties of the Central Valley. And the Association of Monterey Bay Area Governments is serving the 3 Central Coast counties for our regions. And just a quick overview, codes and standards. We are bringing trainings like this one to our constituents. And we also have a service called Energy Code Coach, where we can provide professional services and assistance with energy code. And these programs are being administered through our partners in Balance Green Consulting. And with that, I can pass it off to Andy Pease and Tatiana Soglin to take it from here. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. It's great to be here. I love having all of you. This is the inaugural year of the CCR REN program, and we're delighted to be a partner. I'm here today with Tatiana, and she and I will be going back and forth as we talk about CALGreen. I'm an architect and lead accredited professional. Tatiana is also lead accredited professional and a Greenpoint rated advisor. So we spend a lot of time with CALGreen as a firm, and so we provide these services directly, and we're an education provider and energy code coach. As Jess started to talk about, that the Rural REN Codes and Standards program has these trainings. We can do topics on request if your jurisdiction or your community organization needs to understand something about either the energy code or CALGreen. We'll also provide over-the-counter ADU support, other specialty kinds of services, references. And then there's an energy code coach program. It's open to building departments, plans examiners, building professionals, design professionals, owners, and it's totally free. Anybody in the rural REN territories has access to it. There's an easy online form. We'll give you a link at the end. And you get a code coach from our firm who will respond in a day or two, and a phone call or email, depending on how you submit that question. All right. Today's learning objectives, we're looking all about CALGreen, residential, non-residential. We're going to go through the whole thing in an hour and a half. And mandatory measures, a little bit about Tier 1, Tier 2, and kind of both submitting and reviewing compliance. These are, today's session is worth 1.5 learning units, either for ICC or AIA. And if you're a licensed architecture looking for a zero net carbon design, the content of today's class will meet that requirement as well. And at the end, we'll provide an email where you can request a certificate for that. Both of the class is being recorded, so you can watch the video after the fact, and we'll provide a PDF of the slides after the class as well, so you don't have to take copious notes. And if any of the slides are kind of word heavy, that's because we figure you'll have access to it later. First, a poll. We're going to find out what your comfort level is with CalGreen, kind of a who's in the room. It's anonymous, so do not worry. We're not going to tag you for not knowing what you're looking for here, but it's good to know who's in the room. There's always an option if you're in the wrong class. We understand if you drop out, not a problem. All right. So thanks for some good response here. A lot of familiarity. Some folks just starting out. That's great too. Some we'll definitely hit on the new stuff. So yeah, perfect. So we're smack in the middle of where we need to be. Love it. All right. And with that, we'll go on and do an overview of CalGreen. So, okay, what is the intent of CalGreen? Sorry, I'm messing with a couple things here. So the intent of CalGreen is to provide a baseline of green building. And it was meant to be kind of entry level in some ways, in that it wants to be feasible. So it's trying to bring up the level of green building and then have these voluntary or reach codes. Today, we're really going to focus on those mandatory measures because that's what is applying to everything. So the evolution of our code, right? We started out with the energy code in the 1970s. In late 90s, early 2000s is really when the USGBC and the LEED certification program came onto the market and is still very dominant there. And then CalGreen 2009, totally voluntary, and then became mandatory in 2011. And just like the rest of our code cycles, updates every 3 years, so that we're getting better buildings and you're meeting code. So however somebody feels about the green building code, no matter what, you want to be able to comply with it more easily and effectively. If I didn't mention before, you're always welcome to put comments in the chat. Jess and Tatiana will be monitoring the chat as we go along. And so some questions we can maybe answer on the fly, and other ones will kind of save to the end. So as a recap, of course, the California Building Standards Title 24 has a whole bunch of parts to it. And the one that we are looking at is the California Green Building Standards Code, Part 11, CalGreen. Not to be confused with the Energy Code. They do overlap. All of the codes overlap with each other in some ways or another. So that is where we're going to be living today, is in Part 11. And for those kind of newer to this particular code, that the adopting agencies, you have to kind of keep an eye out, because there's a residential and a non-residential section. So Housing and Community Development has a section, and the Building Standards Commission has the non-residential section. So DSA and OSHPD also have adopted various parts of the code. So you have to kind of keep an eye out for parentheses as you go along to make sure it fits. And here's how it's organized, chapters 1 through 8, plus the appendices. And the main event is in chapter 4 and chapter 5. So, but there is some important stuff in chapter 3, that's the scoping. So for residential, it applies to all new construction and to alterations and additions that add area or volume. Note that the CalGreen, if you're doing an addition or alteration, it doesn't trigger upgrades to other parts of your project unless it's something like old plumbing fixtures that's outside of CalGreen. So just the new stuff would need to apply. In non-residential, it's new construction, and then the renovation addition part is limited to additions over 1,000 square feet or alterations that are over $200,000 in permit valuation. So the really small projects, you don't have to apply CalGreen and bring in that CalGreen worksheet, etc. But that dollar amount has not raised in, well, since we've been looking at the code. So it buys less and less in terms of project scope. And then parking lot alterations and additions will also trigger CalGreen, as we'll look at when we get to EV charging. Also within chapter 3 is in terms of scope is this mixed occupancy. So you need to residential needs to comply with its section, non-res with its section. So the mixed use buildings, we submit 2 checklists, one for each section. If you're doing an apartment multifamily building and there's a community room that's just for the residents, that stays within the residential scope. But if you do have a, restaurant or store on the ground floor and then the residential above, you'll need 2 checklists. Same with phased projects is that you need to be aware of what's in the scope of work within that project. For shell building, the initial TI will have to follow the new construction rules. The second TI counts as an alteration, so that 1,000 square feet and $200,000 limits will apply to that. Okay, and then the macro process of showing CALGreen compliance is that you should have a CALGreen checklist. Either you can have an Excel document that has all the code sections and that gets put onto your plan sheets, or the AIA California has this handy dandy plan. And it is a great worksheet. They update it for every code cycle. But the trick is, if it looks just like this, then that is not compliant. It needs to have a yes or not applicable. There's a column there. So the architect should check off the correct boxes for each section as they go. And if it is a yes, it needs to have the detailed sheet reference. So we find a lot of plans where they knew to put in this sheet, but they didn't know to fill it out. Seems obvious, but that is the thing to do on this sheet. All right, now we're going to launch into mandatory measures. We're going to walk through each of these divisions, planning and design, energy, water, materials, and then environmental quality. The chapters themselves, these divisions, there's all grouped together in division 4 is for residential and then 5 is non-residential. But there's so many parallels as we walk through, we're going to list them all at the same time, kind of in sequential order. As we go through, we're going to show the code reference section down here in the bottom right, so you can go back and look at it yourself. And if we have notes on documentation, we're going to provide those in the gray boxes. Any questions so far? How are we doing? Everybody's with us. All right, good. So within that very first section, planning, there's a newer section that came into effect in July of 2024 about reuse of existing buildings. And it's part of a conversation about embodied carbon specific to additions and alterations. But we're not going to dig into that right now. It's the very first thing that we're going to start with going out of sequence. We'll put a pin in that. And then when we get to materials, we'll discuss all the embodied carbon kinds of options at that time. All right, stormwater pollution prevention during construction. If it's less than an acre, CALGreen has kind of the specific normal controls that you'd want in terms of dust and erosion and those types of strategies. So it's good to have a place to put those things. And then if you're over an acre or more, then you're going into the NPDES system and has its own rigorous program for that. So making sure that the site or civil drawings have either the local ordinance or the best management practices or the requirements of the larger program. Grading and paving, not surprisingly, we want to slope the pavement away from the building. And then this photo on the left is showing some low impact development, which is a good strategy to be able to manage the drainage once it's away from your building. But the mandatory part there is the actual sloping away from the buildings, and that should be shown on the flat work plans. If you're not altering the site itself, then you don't have to abide by that requirement. Into the bicycle parking, in the current code cycle 2022, the bike parking only applies to non-residential projects. So there's a short-term bike parking. It needs to have permanent racks within 200 feet of the visitor's entrance. So if I'm biking to a store, an office building, then I want to be able to put my park my bike pretty close to the front entrance and do my shopping and get on my way. And the way this current code has this listed is that it's in proportion to how many car parking spaces you have, which is kind of problematic because if you just have a lot with 40 cars, like how many are employee or how many are visitors? So you'll see that we actually end up having that, I think, improved in the next code cycle. So long-term, again, non-res only, and it's related to your tenant occupants, and we're looking for long-term bicycle storage. So a safe place to leave your bike for a 8-hour work shift or whatever. So here's our new for 2025. This is, again, we'll try to highlight these as we go so that in January of 26, when this takes effect, you'll be ready. So short-term bike parking, kind of similar, except now that it's 20% of peak daily visitors. So however many visitors you think that you're going to get at your peak, we're going to have 20 people at our stores, then we're going to need 4 bike racks out in front in a convenient kind of way. And then like long-term parking, it should be easy for employees to get there from the street without having to drag their bikes up a set of stairs. And again, it's now as a percentage of tenant occupants, meaning employees who are going to be in there. And the tenant occupants could also be, permanent volunteers or folks who are going to be there for longer than a shift. And a minimum of 1 for each building type. And then also new for 2025 code cycle is residential parking. I'm super excited about this. A lot of cities have done this as a additional local requirement, so that if you are having a multifamily housing or hotels, motels, then you again need visitor racks so that I can go and bike and visit my friends, or long-term biking for those who live there and have a bike. So it's 1 bike space for every 2 dwelling units. So not a ton, but it'll make a significant difference. And then hotels and motels is based on square feet of hotel with a minimum of 2 spaces. All right. And then bike parking continues. That was already in the public schools and community colleges. So overall, within the bike racks, you should not only show the bike racks on your site plans, whether it's landscape or civil, or usually both, it would be a good way to do that. But the calculation should be on the cover sheet so that the plans examiner and the building inspector is on the same page in agreement with the calculation, especially now when it's kind of based on a number of parking spaces. So we'll make sure that's covered. And then what does long-term bike parking look like? It can look like these lockers. There's a whole bunch of varieties of what that looks like. You can have a bike cage in the parking structure. This one on the right is out in the open, and maybe would be you'd need to kind of clarify to see if this is easy to use or not. And then the one on the bottom right isn't acceptable also because it's not mounted. It's just kind of sitting there. So somebody could lift up the whole thing and off with it.
One question really quick, Andy.
Sure.
Eric asked how are peak daily visitors to be determined at plan review?
Yeah, great question. So we use LEED certification as a model for a lot of these open-ended where it doesn't necessarily define. And so if it's a retail store, for example, or an office application, peak visitors might be, okay, do we have a conference room where visitors from outside of the office would be there? So sometimes peak visitors is 4, like, something really small that goes with an office. Retail would have maybe peak visitors is 40 people wandering around the store. So it's a judgment call of the actual use that's being permitted. If it's a TI and it's just the shell, then that's a little trickier, right? So you kind of make some judgment calls about what you think, and then once the TI happens, they might actually need to add bike racks to be appropriate for that. Thanks. All right, now we're going into the electric vehicle charging section. And this, just in this current code cycle and then upcoming in the new one, there's been a lot of changes. So we're going to spend some time in here talking about the definitions, then the applicable requirements for single family, multifamily, non-res, and then kind of commercial heavy duty truck charging. Again, kind of getting ready for that, and then what applies to additions and alterations. So first, there's 3 types. There's a lot of terminology in this section, and so we're trying to kind of keep it with some visuals here. So the 3 types, the first is EV capable, and that's basically empty conduit and a space available on an electric panel. So, and the debate here was, well, should there actually be wires in that? And this is often applicable to, you don't know if it's ever going to need a charging station. So don't have a stranded asset in terms of running actual wire through it, but make it easier that you can. So empty conduit and panel space. The next one is EV ready. And so this is charged up and it's has an outlet so that it is ready to receive a plug-in from a car. So if you think of a hybrid kind of example where they have a cord, they plug it into the car, and the other one's an outlet, this would be the type of EV ready space. And then EV charging station is when you have an actual charger that's wired up and ready to go and ready to plug into a car. So that's the charging station. And so within these types of chargers, again, level 1 is just the, little device for the car and an outlet. Level 2 charger, which is an electric vehicle charging station, that's what meets that requirement. And it could be, something that's wall mounted or stationary. Level 3 are the direct current fast chargers, and those are the Tesla typically. And they're allowed, but they are not required by code at all, ever. So in terms of the 2 types of level 2, there's the level 2 where, again, it's kind of like one of these ones that you might see at a supermarket that you can go and charge your car when you're on the road trip, or it could be a smaller device that's back at your, an apartment complex or something like that. But there's also a low power level 2, and that is a 20 amp, and it goes to a receptacle, which is super useful, and we're seeing show up. The interesting thing is that, the market, capitalism, brings something new to bear for that. So there are now opportunities for even an outlet to be able to have a cost recovery opportunity. So, because that's, otherwise problematic if you're providing a gazillion outlets for your project and don't have a way to pay for make people pay for that electricity. So those are kind of the definitions, the scope of what we're looking at in the new single family construction. If they have their own garage, then they just need to be EV capable. So that's the one that just has conduit, no charger, no wiring, just electrical panel space and the charger. ADUs and JADUs are not required to provide that. So if that's the addition or new construction by state law, they're exempt. As a side note for the future versus installed in a commercial setting, or even in a residential setting, if you, it's important that things have labels. So the breaker itself, the panel space should have a label, and the stub up, if you have that, should also be labeled for future EV. But don't label the parking space because there's no actual equipment there yet. And then once it's installed, then you should label the parking spaces that they're for EV charging only, if that's the case. Multifamily hotel motel. There's a lot of hubbub in July when the intervening code cycle really increased the requirements there. So hotel and multifamily currently require 40% of all the parking spaces to be level 2 EV charging receptacles. 40%. Wow. And another 10% need to actually have have 10% of level 2 EV chargers. It's a lot. So, but again, it's an equity thing, right? Is that you have folks who are living in apartment buildings and have no way to be able to charge their electric vehicles. So that was limited. So, and a note for the multifamily is that the requirement is, if at all possible, a multifamily parking space, the receptacle or the charger should be linked to that actual unit so they can pay for their own electricity use in that moment. So unless it's infeasible, but if you have assigned parking, it should be tied to that occupant meter. So for the next code cycle, and starting in January, we have a separation between multifamily and hotel motels. So now in multifamily, it's even more. So if you have assigned parking, that every single unit should have one of these level 2 EV charging receptacles. So it's basically putting kind of the equivalency of a single family to each of these multifamily units. And if every unit doesn't have a spot, then you have 100% of those spaces up until that. So if you have 30 units and 40 parking spaces that aren't assigned, you still have to have 30 of those parking spaces have these level 2 outlets. And then also in the common areas, 25% need to have the actual chargers. So big emphasis on being able to plug in things yourself. And then if there's opportunity to have these EV chargers. And then hotels, motels is similar to the current code where it's 40%, but then they up the level 2 to 25%. So lots of charging there. All right, so current code for non-residential, it's based on the number of spaces. And so there's EV capable, so you have the conduit, and then EV charging stations where you have an actual station. Again, you're allowed to put in ones like charge point where they have to pay some money. It doesn't say you can't recover a cost. And so it's based on how many total parking spaces there are. Note that it's additive. I mean, so if there are 8 EV capable spaces and 2 EVCS, actually the 2 EVCS in this case are part of the capable. So in that case, you would go to 6 EV capable and 2 EV chargers. I don't know why they wanted to make that a little bit confusing, but the idea is that you have all these capable spaces and then a couple of them you turn into chargers. There's maybe another way to think about that. And so now in the 2025 code, starting in January, you can see that everything EV capable stays the same, but we're doing more EV charging stations, and office and retail have even more. So everything in bold is increased. There's some alternative approaches that are available, so gives a little bit of flexibility for the project owner. For one, if you want to do DC fast chargers, you can do that, and that will replace 5 of the level 2 chargers. But if you do that option, you need to have at least one of the chargers be a regular level 2. Oops. You can also go slower. So you can have more spaces that are lower power, like if you just don't have the amperage, but then you need twice as many. There's also a power allocation method. I personally haven't used this yet, but then there's a way where you can kind of adapt to kind of what's emerging on the market. Accessibility has some overlap, of course, with electric vehicle charging. So for the EV charging stations that are non-residential uses that or motels, public housing, they just comply with Chapter 11B, and there's clear language about that in terms of clear space, etc. Note that if you're putting in charging stations, they need to be van accessible, but or at least one needs to be van accessible, but the charging station van accessible space doesn't count for the accessible space for the project overall, right? So it's you have to add additional EV accessible parking spaces. In the last code cycle, they also added accessibility for multifamily. Chapter 11 is silent on that. I guess that's 11A. CalGreen now has a section that shows, you know, you need to have the 5-foot or the 8-foot aisle in between, depending on the width of the space. So similar on all of that. All right, and then kind of wrapping up the charging section here. First, heads up that the medium and heavy duty charging is that we're trying to have select commercial uses, so grocery stores, manufacturing, office, retail, warehouse, is that depending on the size that and the kind of the loading spaces that are off street, then you need to have capacity for future charging. So it's more about making sure that you have the electricity and the raceway there, but you don't have to have the charging equipment at this time. But of course, you can kind of read the room about what we'll see in future cycles. Charging at public schools, community colleges, they have a similar table kind of approach, but just different numbers. And there's no changes to that in the next code cycle. And then in this 2024 intervening code cycle, there was an addition of parking lot additions and alterations. Maybe that was just new to the 2022 code cycle. So they figure if you're tearing up a parking lot to add lighting, or doing a major alteration to the parking lot, or a new addition to a parking lot, that would be a good time to add EV charging capacity. So in the current code cycle, it's 10% of spaces that are added or altered must be EV ready. But in 2025, basically everything that's new or altered must be EV ready or EVCF. Instead of 10%, it's kind of all of them up until what would be for new construction, right? So if it's oversized. Non-res projects, there was a regular parking table. This one says, hey, if you've got existing, it's still the same as that, but in addition, if you have existing EV capable spots, that you should go ahead and just bump them up to EV charging stations. So there's some nuances in there. So if you get in that situation, you probably dig into the section of the code. And then documentation for EVs. This again, we try to work with architects to make the drawings a little user-friendly, both for the jurisdiction and for the builder. So if you're showing an EVCS, well, this is a ready spot that you show it on here, that helps the plans examiner see what that's going to be. But if you're actually showing the striping, then that helps the builder know what the striping is. And so you should have the calculations on the cover sheet and make sure that there's alignment with the electrical plans.
Before
that
we
was the EV section. All right, so how are we doing, Tatiana?
We have one question. You may have answered part of it on the alteration slide. This one says, could you please re-explain when these CALGreen measures apply to a TI? For example, a retail shell TI requires updated bicycle parking per CALGreen, even though there's no change in use. What about EV charging? Will that be required for a TI or only if the parking lot is altered?
Yeah, great question. And there is some subtlety there. So for one, if it's the initial TI, then that counts as new construction. So what we've seen, unfortunately, is that somebody will do the building shell and they'll say, well, we don't know what the uses are. And so then they don't necessarily put in the site improvements that are going to be needed. And then that is I don't think it's appropriate to let that slide that the TI person comes in and then there's no charging infrastructure. So that's probably the reason why the initial CalGreen was based on the number of parking spots, because then it was tied to the actual construction of the parking versus the occupant count, right? But then it still was too hard to judge about whether one's an occupant or visitor tenant occupant. So the initial TI definitely needs to have the parking improvements. And then after that, a TI is an alteration and should not trigger any of the other requirements for charging. And then if you have an existing building and you're not even changing the building, but you're upgrading the parking lot in some way, like with new lighting, then that would trigger the EV charging requirements. But if you're just restriping, even if the restriping is efficient and you get some extra parking spaces, if it's just restriping, it does not trigger the EV charging. So if hopefully that caught it all, but if not, just ping us again and we'll go over the specifics. All right, and there's just a couple more in the site section here. One is light pollution. These have been in the code for a long time in terms of the backlight, uplight, and glare calculations, or stricter local if it's there. And then there's some exceptions. They've done a good job over the last code cycles to align it with the energy code so that there's some exceptions for kind of a low lumens fixture. So making sure that the lighting schedule either shows the lumens that are compliant or shows the bug rating. And those are dependent on their distance from the property line. So it's a little bit of a couple layers to check with that one. And then if you're working on schools, DSA has some requirements that are specific to shade trees. And that was the kind of the site planning requirements. Okay, energy efficiency, here we go. Must comply with Title 24. That's it. Really, that's all you do. Yeah, okay. And then we get into water and efficiency and conservation. I'll turn that over to Tatiana.
Thanks, Andy. The requirements for fixtures and fittings are pretty straightforward. This chart shows the allowed flush or flow rates in gallons per minute, gallons per flush, or gallons per cycle. An important thing to pay attention to here are things like water sense labels for toilets and shower heads. And another thing we want to make note of is the residential bathroom faucets. These have a maximum of 1.2 gallons per minute, but they're the only fixture with a minimum rate of 0.8. So sometimes in mixed-use buildings, there will be a blanket 0.5 GPM faucet put in for all lavatory faucets, but that doesn't meet the minimum required for the residential spaces. So we want to make sure we're hitting that threshold where it's required. There are mandatory measures related to water submeters. We put together this decision tree to help determine if submeters are required depending on the project type. For non-residential projects, a new construction project or an addition over 50,000 square feet needs a submeter if you have a use over 100 gallons per day. If it's less than 50,000 square feet, you don't need a submeter unless it is an excessive use, which is over 1,000 gallons per day. That could be something like a building with multiple tenants, and there's a use like a restaurant or a laundromat. In those cases, you'll need submeters. For multifamily, all units must be submetered per the plumbing code. And this also includes ADUs. So as a reminder, projects are considered multifamily if it's 2 units or more. So those would need to have separate submeters to help with accountability for water use and for billing. Food waste disposers also have a gallons per minute maximum threshold. They must be less than 1 gallon per minute when not in use or have an automatic shut off after 10 minutes of inactivity. And they must be less than 8 gallons per minute when in use. And all this will need to be included in the plumbing fixture schedule. For landscaping and outdoor water use, you'll use the Model Water Efficient Landscape Ordinance, or MWELO for short. This is a tool for looking at outdoor water usage for landscapes over 500 square feet. You'll need a table similar to this one. It doesn't have to be color coded. We just like this photo. In the bottom left, it might be a little hard to see, but there's a calculation for the maximum applied water allowance, or MAWA, giving the amount of gallons of water you're allowed to use annually based on the project location's evapotranspiration rate and landscape area. Then we'll compare that to the proposed usage, which is based on the plant type and irrigation efficiency. And these should be somewhere on the landscape plans. A lot of times we see it either in the irrigation plan or planting plan. For special uses, MWELO is required for public schools and community colleges where there's 500 square feet of newly constructed landscape projects or 1,200 square feet of rehabilitated landscape projects, and healthcare facilities must comply as well. And now I think I'm passing it back to Andy for materials.
All right, so we'll start in on the materials section here. Some of these are so anyway, but I'll touch on them because then at least we can all point to the same thing about what is required. So in general, this is we're doing a lot of air sealing, but CALGreen does have specific requirements about rodent proofing. And one thing that's important here is that within the rodent proofing, rodent seal, all the penetrations with some material that's not foam. The foam falls apart, gets chewed up. It needs to be cementitious concrete or metal or something like that to keep the critters out. And then the weather protection for as required for by the CDC. And then moisture control, again, kind of obvious. Don't have sprinklers go onto the buildings. That's not allowed. And then this one we're still finding folks not picking up on it, but it's getting a little bit better, is that if you have an exterior entry, that you need to have ways to keep the water out. So it can be, first there needs to be some overhangs at the exterior entries, or a recess, or some way that the any kind of driving rain is not getting into the building itself, and that you want to have non-absorbent flooring within those first couple of feet. So as you can imagine, just those materials getting wet and then rotting and molding and things that are unhealthy. Within construction waste management, that we want to have minimum waste diversion of 65%. It had been steadily increasing the percent diversion, but it's kind of holding at 65%. We've been challenged in terms of waste diversion for the materials and the markets of those products. So hazardous waste is excluded from that. 100% of that needs to, be ditched someplace else. So it's just the remaining amounts, and then that requires a construction waste management diversion plan, waste management plan, and a statement of the results. So you can ask for those as you go. There's also an optional pathway where you can actually reduce the generation in a pounds per square feet of waste, varies residential to non-residential. boy, this is tough to do, but if you are doing like offsite panel prefab kind of construction, that would probably be an appropriate approach because there is a lot less on-site waste for that approach. For additions and alterations, there needs to be a plan for, they call it universal waste. So these are fluorescent lamps, ballast, anything that contains mercury. So any of those kinds of regular household materials that are not going to be needed on site. And as a reminder, of course, soil, land clearing debris, none of that should go into the landfill in the first place. If there's vegetation, it should be recycled as mulch. Make sure those requirements are all on the plans and that they're verified in terms of waste management plans. Okay, embodied carbon. Woohoo!
Before we get into that, a question just came in about waste management. Are agency construction projects subject to waste management plans or only projects with construction or demolition permits?
I'm not sure I understand agency and construction. If I guess I would say that it's projects that require a construction permit or a demolition permit. So it's kind of yeah, construction waste diversion. Does that help? If somebody needs to maybe unmute and let us know. I'm not sure.
Hi, yes, thank you. I was just considering the city's like pavement rehabilitation projects, or if we are doing a park improvement project where there might be construction debris, but we're not taking out a permit or anything like that. Do we need to require that in our specs?
Yeah, no, I think that's required for that kind of construction, because if the private sector would be requiring a permit for tearing up a street, even though it's an internal construction permit, it would still need to comply with code. So like if you're doing a lighting, if you're doing a renovation of your own city hall, you're running it through a permitting process. So whatever process would be required, even if it's internal, then you would still need to comply with that construction waste diversion. Now, I mean, that being said, concrete is one of the easiest. That's like 100% construction diversion. So they typically kind of steel and concrete pavement are the easiest to recycle, typical. Does that help?
Yes, thank you very much.
Yeah, sure. Thank you.
All right, let's dig into embodied carbon. So effective July 1st of last year, it is now required as part of the CALGreen code to address embodied carbon on non-residential projects 100,000 square feet or more, or schools under jurisdiction of DSA 50,000 square feet or more. This will reduce on January 1st of 2026 to 50,000 square feet for all non-residential projects under the 2025 code cycle. So there are 3 pathways to compliance, and we'll briefly walk you through these. It's building reuse, life cycle analysis, and the prescriptive pathway. To understand each option, we need to know what embodied carbon is, where embodied carbon shows up in the construction process, and the scope for looking at each of those pathways. So embodied carbon refers to the greenhouse gas emissions coming from the manufacturing, transportation, installation, maintenance, and disposal of building materials. We don't want to get this confused with operational carbon, which is related to the greenhouse gas emissions due to building energy consumption. That's the type of carbon emissions you're probably more used to hearing about. You may have seen a chart like this before showing where you'll find that carbon in the construction process. And at the bottom, we see the cradle to gate scope looks at the product stage. This is your raw materials extraction, transportation, and manufacturing, the things that go into making the product. This is the scope that you're looking at for the prescriptive pathway. The next is cradle to grave. This includes the product stage, but also construction, use, and end of life stages. This is the scope included in the whole building life cycle assessment. And last is cradle to cradle, which includes the whole cradle to grave scope, but additionally includes beyond the building life cycle, things like recycling and reuse. And that's where the building reuse pathway comes into play. So now looking at a little more of a detailed overview, we have our building reuse options for additions, where the addition is less than 2 times the area of the existing building. The mandatory measure for CALGreen requires 45% of the structure and enclosure to be reused. Next is the whole building life cycle analysis. This is a modeling pathway where you'll need to show a 10% reduction in the embodied carbon from a baseline building. And last is the prescriptive pathway, which targets carbon reductions in specific materials. And for the mandatory measure, this limits the global warming potential to 175% of the industry-wide average. And we'll find those on the environmental product declarations, or EPDs. So this is an example of documenting the reuse of an existing building pathway. Again, this method is for additions or alterations where the addition is less than 2 times the area of the existing building. So for our example here, we have a 45,000 square foot existing building with an 80,000 square foot addition. We can get super into the weeds on this stuff, but for now, I'm going to keep this as a quick overview, and you can always go back and review the slides later. This method targets primary structural elements and building enclosure materials as seen on the bottom left, and it excludes hazardous materials as well as windows and insulation. And that's to encourage replacing the windows and insulation with higher performing materials. So this is how you do the calculation and documentation. You make a quick spreadsheet listing out the areas for the primary structure and enclosure elements and the areas for those materials that will be retained. Add up those values, drop them in the worksheet below, which is provided by CALGreen, and then we'll take a percentage of the retained area for both and do the total percentage. So for this example, we're retaining 54.57%. And as a reminder, total percentage needs to exceed 45%. So this project is complying. For the second method, we have the whole building life cycle assessment. To do this method, you'll need to build a model very similar to an energy model, but instead of measuring energy usage, it measures embodied carbon. So again, this one's looking at the cradle to grave scope over a reference study period of 60 years. You're looking at the same materials as the building reuse method, except this time you're including glazing and insulation. A lot of people ask how to generate a baseline to compare your designed building to, and the reference building or your baseline building should have the same location, orientation, size, function, and space conditioning as the proposed, so that way we're ensuring that we're just comparing the materials. And the materials for the baseline should be based off of what a typical building design for a project of that type in that location would have. And we've listed some tools below here. Athena and One-Click LCA are free tools. There are paid software options as well, such as Sphera, SEMA Pro, and Tally. Tally in particular has a Revit plugin, so if you have a good Revit model already built, it can be imported into that program so that another model doesn't have to be completely built from scratch. So this is just a quick example of what a project looks like in Athena. It's a typical trunk and branch structure. If you're familiar with energy models, it looks very similar. You'll go through and describe building assemblies through dialog boxes that request simple information like base sizes and loads, and the software will do the rest for you. It calculates a bill of materials and the associated environmental impacts. Users also have the flexibility to add materials as needed, or you can import your own bill of materials from any CAD program. And CALGreen also provides a worksheet for this method where you would then input the values that come out of the assessment to display compliance. The last of the 3 pathways for embodied carbon is the prescriptive path. This method has a much more limited scope, targeting some of the higher impact materials as determined by the Buy Clean California program, like certain types of steel, glass, and insulation, and of course, concrete. So this table here shows you the maximum acceptable global warming potential, or GWP, which was based off of industry-wide averages. For the products on the top half of the chart, you just need to find products with a GWP below what is allowed. And for concrete on the bottom half, compliance is determined by a weighted calculation. So each type of concrete has a different allowed GWP value and will have a different actual GWP. So to determine compliance, you'll follow this equation, multiply each actual GWP with the volume used, and add those together to get the total carbon impact, and then do the same for the GWP allowed. And you'll just want to make sure the actual GWP value is lower than the allowed. And product data for each material can be found on environmental product declarations, or EPDs. This is an example of where you can find it. You can see the GWP values right at the top in that first row. So that's kind of just a very, very quick overview of the 3 methods. So realistically, right now, most of us are not working on 100,000 square foot buildings where the requirement is being triggered by code. But as we mentioned earlier, the square footage threshold will be reduced to 50,000 square feet in January of 2026. And over time, we can expect it to become more relevant to a wider variety of projects. So we want to start thinking about strategies addressing embodied carbon now, so that when it is required for projects you're working on, you're already more familiar with it. So this slide has a lot of words. I'm not going to go super into depth into each one, but here we're calling out some of the high impact material categories for cost-effective low carbon product selection. Generally speaking, concrete and steel are typically the places that many projects find to be great areas for potential embodied carbon reduction at no or low cost premium. So this could be through using alternative cementitious material for concrete, or steel with high recycled content. And there are also opportunities in insulation, glazing, and finish materials. This slide here displays the embodied carbon of some different insulation materials. Some shown are more net carbon emitting, and others are net carbon sequestering. Not all insulation material works for all conditions, of course, but where a substitution is feasible, charts like this can kind of act as a guide to select alternative products. Foam materials tend to be pretty common and are among the highest in carbon emissions. Mineral wool is still net emitting, though lower than foam, and fiberglass bats are a bit lower. Then switching to non-petroleum products such as cellulose, hempcrete, and straw bale, that can move more towards sequestering carbon instead of net emitting. And we have some photos here to the right of expanded cork, wood fiberboard like Gutex, and even emergent technologies like mycelium board, which is made out of mushrooms. We can see there's a lot of insulation options and there's a lot of emerging technologies as well. So keep your eyes out for more coming on that.
Awesome,
And
thank
now
you.
pass back to Andy.
Awesome, great, thank you so much. And then also within the materials section is thinking about kind of the operations and maintenance of a building that's also impactful for the health and wellness and durability of a building. Within the code section is about providing building owner representative with an owner's manual. It can be an online cloud-based manual, so everything from how to operate your dishwasher to the warranties that come. But there's also specific chapters within there that are required for testing of systems, how to get, what are some suggestions for energy savings, what's a maintenance schedule that would be appropriate for that particular construction system. In 2022, they added that maintenance manual, O&M manual should have a section about defensible space, again, thinking about fire sensitivity there. Within the non-residential setting, a commissioning kind of process could be helpful as well. We've seen building departments actually require the kind of first draft of the O&M manual as part of their permit requirement, or a building inspector can ask for it at the end. Again, it can be a physical thing or it can be a cloud-based location as well. Occupants need to have space for recycling. That's in the code as well, and it needs to be sized appropriately for the particular project and the size. Also, it doesn't spell out in the CALGreen, but as folks are thinking about their space for recycling, making sure that there's also space that's appropriate for organic, since restaurant food waste is increasingly being required to manage their organic waste appropriately. So commissioning is a system for, we talk about a circle of accountability to make sure that a building is basically operating as it was supposed to. This is typically in the non-residential sector, although we've seen it for larger multifamily housing as well. And it starts with the owner and the owner project requirements, so that everything from what kind of products that they want to see to what kind of light levels, how they're going to be using the spaces. And it's all about the systems that are energy related. So mechanical, ventilation, hot water, lighting, all of those pieces go into there. The owner project requirements then go to the design team, and the design team develops a basis of design that responds to the owner project requirements. We selected this kind of mechanical system because the owner wanted this kind of efficiency and operating capacity or zonal control or something like that. Then it goes into the design itself. And so then there's plans and specs. The commissioning authority is on board the project at this point and is reviewing the plans and specs and the OPR and the BOD to make sure that all of those things are in alignment. The commissioning authority then develops a commissioning plan that says, hey, here's what we're going to do toward the end of construction and during construction to make sure that all those things that the owner wanted are actually getting implemented, and confirming that design. Within the construction itself, there are performance tests, whether it's holding up a light meter to make sure that the light levels are being achieved, or checking with a spot thermometer that the temperatures that are coming out the way they're supposed to. And then at the end of that whole project, the commissioning authority provides a report to the owner. Did that kind of bringing all of those pieces together, does it meet that owner project requirements in the first place? So it's an important process, and California requires it because they see that it works. It improves efficiency, comfort, health, and safety. It is that full process is required for non-residential buildings, 10,000 square feet or more. It doesn't, like storage buildings, it doesn't trigger, but pretty much everything else it does. In terms of those pieces, parts and pieces that we just went over, the OPR, the BOD, and the commissioning plan. Oops, my line missed one. The commissioning plan, those are all part of the permit process. So those should come in with as part of the permitting. And then in the field is the functional performance testing, the documentation. There's requirement for training of the building staff or whoever is going to maintain the building. And then there should be a commissioning report at the end. There's a commissioning form that's in the energy code. So CALGreen has some sample documents that you're allowed to use. And then the energy code also has this document. So this is one where there's these two codes come together almost entirely, so that what's in the energy code mostly covers CALGreen, but there are a couple of key differences there to watch out. But if you are using this form, you can either do that BOD, OPR, commissioning plan. You can either kind of use this form to be able to create those documents, or we usually just generate them in Word format and then just attach them as part of the PDF submittal, and that's allowed as well. But it is important to note that that the energy code also requires design review for projects that are under 10,000 square feet. So there's a design review process for, CALGreen energy code for over 10,000, but if it's less than that, CALGreen or the energy code requires that design review. And it can be done by the architect in-house, but there is a checklist that you have to go through. Also, on the flip side, CALGreen has a requirement that adds irrigation and renewable energy as part of the commission process. So if you're doing LEED certification on a project, thankfully all of this will be covered as a prerequisite, but otherwise you got to look out for all those parts and pieces. Within CALGreen, for those projects that are under 10,000 square feet, there is a requirement for a testing and adjusting plan. And that's going to be usually the mechanical, electrical engineers are going to describe that system for testing and adjusting for, again, those systems that use energy and balancing and reporting and all of that. So making sure that those are included in the notes or the specifications. So that was the materials section. Any other questions come in on materials before we go to environmental quality? No? All right, keep going.
Oh, one just came in. When is third-party review required?
Yeah, great question. So it's for projects that are either very large or complex. So 50,000 square feet is considered a very large building. And a complex mechanical system is anything more than a packaged HVAC system. So, so in theory, so that's a little bit of a, we haven't found a precise definition that's kind of relevant in terms of complex systems. So, but definitely by size, and then there's a little bit of a judgment call about what is a complex mechanical system would require a third party review. Otherwise, it can be a review within the organization of somebody who is not directly involved in the project. And if you want more information, let us know. We can dig into that section a little bit. Okay, so environmental quality. Again, this is one of those fireplaces don't have open combustion. Okay, so within ventilation, current code says if you're operating a mechanical system, during construction, you can do a MERV 8 filter. So if you're installing the carpet and you want to have the space conditioned heating or cooling during that process, you can just put in a MERV 8 and then replace the filters prior to occupancy. And then permanent ventilation, must be MERV 13, so supply and return. Starting in the next code cycle is that the temporary air filters must also be MERV 13. Kind of makes sense, right? I think they were pacing themselves when MERV 13 came into effect as a requirement. Within that indoor air quality category comes covering of duct openings, protecting mechanical equipment during construction. So these are examples at the bottom that are not good. So you can't just leave them open-ended or put some plastic wrap that keeps busting. You can't just stuff stuff into the opening, or in this, kind of classic crushed duct kind of situation. So what we're seeing works pretty well. It's often blue that they cover the ducts. Ideally, the ducts will come onto site all wrapped up and ready to go. Then they do the install work, then cover them up again at the end of the day. The equipment itself should be covered up until it is actually operational. So keep those covered. If by chance they aren't covered, it's not the end of the world. They can do a proper cleaning kind of protocols. So it's not like they have to rip them out, or that you're kind of like stuck if you're doing the inspection. You can require them to be cleaned and then covered. Pollutant control is kind of one of those original, has been in CALGreen since the beginning, and these were kind of the original categories: adhesives, sealants, and caulks, carpet adhesive, carpet pads, resilient flooring. So that's whether it's linoleum or vinyl flooring, paints and coatings, shellac, actual paint, any of those kind of varnished products, and then composite wood, so MDF, plywood, those types of things. So there's a long list in CALGreen that talks about the volatile organic compound limits for each of those products and adhesives, or for composite wood, it's about the urea formaldehyde and having below a certain threshold there. Those numbers haven't changed for at least a decade in terms of the thresholds. So the market is pretty solid. I'd say that we get great compliance on this, and it feels very redundant to ask for spec sheets because everything generally complies. I would say the times where we've gotten dinged is when somebody uses an outdoor product for an indoor application. So still worth checking on, but like sometimes like carpet, we had a problem with somebody using a really heavy duty adhesive to just tack the edges. In that case, they were able to show kind of a budget, like they used very little of it, but it was higher than the threshold, but the other products were way below the threshold. So it was still compliant in kind of an alternative compliance path. Last year or this year in this current code cycle, they added 3 more categories: insulation, ceiling tiles, and wall panels. And you can look for a spec sheet or a certificate of compliance that shows that it has one of these certifications. So Green Guard is one of those systems. There's also the Carpet and Rug Institute has some thresholds. So those are certificate programs are another way to demonstrate compliance, rather than having to sift through the every individual line item and definition. So the notes should be on the plans, just because of part of that CALGreen compliance, but inspectors can always ask for cut sheets and verification that is required to be available. Tobacco, smoking, so still prohibited. It's surprising how many options for signage are non-compliant. So they'll say 20 feet from the building. Okay, so then we get the 25 right. Maybe a smoking establishment. It's not specific enough. Is that indoor or outdoor? Okay, so here's no smoking within 25 feet of all building entrances. Could work, But the most thorough one is the one that talks about no 20, which this is the code language, no smoking within 25 feet of doorways, operable windows or vents. So if there aren't any operable windows or vents, you could have this middle one, but otherwise this is kind of the more thorough. So again, sometimes seems silly, but if people are visiting from outside the area, or people will just stand outside the door and smoke. Vaping, of course, is also smoking in that scenario. Okay, there's some other requirements that are specific to vapor, air sealing, capillary breaks for concrete. So making sure that there's inspection for those pieces now. And like, here's an example of a slab without the vapor retarder or capillary breaks. So making sure that that you have the plastic, we like to make sure all the seams are taped up to the edges, that this is an important way for air sealing and moisture, stopping moisture from getting into the building. More about moisture, it's like, okay, stacking the plywood and leaving it in the rain, not good. Trying to cover it, okay, that's better, but not quite. But let's really keep it up on lifts and keep it dry. Here's a situation where there was a wet studs, and then down below is an actual moisture meter, so you can go ahead and make sure that the materials don't exceed 19%, and that there should be random floor wall moisture tests by the inspector. And then don't install anything that's obviously damaged. In bathrooms, in this case, a bathroom meaning a tub or shower room, not a half bath, is that you need to have an exhaust fan, and it needs to be ducted to the exterior. It needs to be compliant with Energy Star, at least while we still have Energy Star, and it needs to be controlled by a humidistat. Heating and air conditioning system design. There's ACA manuals, JD and S, and those should, if you're doing a engineered, you have an ASHRAE design, you don't need to worry about this. But if somebody's not going through an engineered system and just having a traditional HVAC contractor going, yeah, I usually make these about this size. They're often oversized and frequently by a lot. So as we have these more efficient systems, more efficient envelopes, we need to make sure that we do the actual duct and equipment sizing, and that we need the calculations and the plans to go along with that. And then within the indoor air quality setup, we also have a few requirements that again make a lot of sense for carbon dioxide monitoring, and that in the current code cycle, that CO2 monitoring is required in classrooms, so K through 12 under DSA. And then in the next code cycle, that's been expanded to use to apply to all university and private school classrooms as well, and any other kind of student meeting space. Acoustic control, this kind of came into green building a little bit later, and when people started to realize how impactful the acoustics are for the health and comfort of the occupants. So that's there's both the indoor internal acoustic control as well as the exterior. In terms of interior, multi-tenant spaces require a minimum of a STC of 40. That's the sound transmission class. So a sound transmission class can be achieved by construction itself, like if you have a double stud, double kind of wall assembly, or additional materials like insulation or a special kind of acoustic board can achieve that. So those need to be either between tenant spaces and between the tenant spaces and public spaces. So if there's like a central hallway, that requires this STC 40, and then in between. So here's an example of a tenant improvement where the first tenant comes in and the second tenant isn't in there yet, but the first tenant needs to make sure that they're putting in that STC 40 acoustic isolation sound wall. And then on the exterior noise front is that if you're in a noise contour line of 65 or more, like an airport, a freeway, or train, then you need to have the kinds of acoustic isolation that would keep the occupants inside the space comfortable. So walls and roof STC 50, and then there's a windows characterization as well that's required as a minimum. Ozone, make sure that we don't have a bunch of ozone CFC things going on, halons. You know, again, that's been in the code a long time. I don't see it coming up all the time, but always interested in stories from others. And then this was added, I think, last year or last code cycle about supermarkets and refrigeration leak reduction in those. So looking at global warming potential, but just trying to kind of catch the edges of GWP issues that we're having. All right, so we're nearing the end. Any questions?
One question says, if you have a window in your bathroom, you don't need a fan rule grandfathered in for older homes, or do all bathrooms require a fan? Asking for a friend.
Asking for a friend. Yeah, it's a great question. And, you know, personally, I think that those of us who grew up with an operable window, I think it's still a safe way to operate because we open our windows. But what they found was a lot of people didn't. And so, and then bathrooms would get moldy. And so then the requirement for a bathroom fan. If you have nobody's going to come in and make you install one if you're not remodeling that bathroom already. If you are remodeling the bathroom with work that requires a permit, then you will have to install a fan. Unless it's like a historic designation or has some other exception. But otherwise, if it's new permitted construction, then it is going to require a fan. There's also other options that are kind of interesting in terms of whole house ventilation that might require a smaller fan, you know, because a lot of times now we're using our bathroom fans as part of our whole house ventilation systems, and it's all, you know, heat recovery ventilation. Anyway, it gets complicated at that, but I'm kind of old school. I'm with you. If you're opening your window, I think it's still safe. All right. Let's finish up here with just a few loose ends. This is, there's chapters 6, 7, and 8. 6, they always update it with links to all the references. So just make sure that you're following what's current. Chapter 7 has some updates in the next code cycle. It's about special inspections, and there's just kind of changes to names and what's required and what references there are. For example, this is what we currently refer to as a HERS rater, home energy rating system. But the next code cycle is changing the name to Energy Code Compliance, ECC verifier, rater. I'm close on that. So anyway, so chapter 7 clarifies some of that language. And then chapter 8 is full of handy dandy forms for your water budget, if you want to do kind of an alternative compliance path, construction waste management, life cycle analysis, commissioning, and that type of thing. And then in terms of the tier 1, tier 2, and how those work, is that they it's almost like, again, a lead checklist. If you worked on those, is that there's prerequisite and then you have some options. So you have to do all the mandatory measures that we've already talked about. Tier 1 and Tier 2 both add some new mandatory measures, so a couple of those, and then you also pick electives. So there's a range of options that are, either more EV parking spaces, or, even lower light pollution, or even more categories with low emitting materials. Those types of things are the electives. More chances, even more embodied carbon reduction or lower thresholds. So that's Tier 1, Tier 2 for residential, that how many electives you have to pick. And it's a little bit stringent, or different tiers for the non-residential as well. And some jurisdictions will pick and choose. They'll either say you have to be all Tier 1 for buildings over 10,000 or 25,000 square feet, or all Tier 2, or they might pick and choose a particular elective measure. Here's an example of one that doesn't show up in any of the mandatory measures, but it does show up as an elective within the Tier 1, Tier 2 options for bird-friendly building design. We're seeing, a lot of bird strike deaths for taller buildings that have a whole bunch of glass. And so they're coming up with these specific strategies with visual markers, etched or fritted. There's kind of a 2x2 rule. If a bird won't typically try to fly through something if it's smaller than 2x2. So having the little spotted grid. You can also put on, pretty pattern. You can have textured glass, like block or channel glass. There's some glazing technologies, kind of fishy if those actually work, or netting, louvers, kind of an extra layer on top. So that's one of those where it could be an elective measure, and maybe it's just a good building practice. So, and maybe it'll show up in a future code cycle. A lot of things that have graduated from Tier 1, Tier 2 to a mandatory measure, like ceiling tiles used to be a Tier 1, Tier 2 option. All right, and with that, we are wrapping up. So another shameless plug for all the great resources of CCR REN and the Codes and Standards program in particular. Please do visit the website. When you go to programs, you'll be able to see the Energy Code Coach, complete our intake form. And it's pretty simple about what it is that you're interested in, and we will get back to you on that. We've done, this has been 4 courses as our debut for courses for this area. And so this was course 3 of 4. And then next month we are doing Introduction to Zero Net Carbon Design. Again, if you're an architect and you're looking for licensure, CEUs, then you can get that course credit. If you do need ZNCD credit for this course, please email me, Andy at inbalancegreen.com. Again, this will come to you in a PDF, so you'll be able to track us down. And we will send you a certificate within a couple weeks. So all courses are virtual and free, and you can register online. If you have other questions, our friends at High Sierra Energy Foundation will be able to help you out. Rural REN. Oops. And with that, I want to thank everybody for coming. I'm going to stop share and be able to turn it back over in case Jess has any closing remarks, or if there's other questions or discussion.
Thank you so much, Andy and Tatiana. That was an amazing presentation. I've learned a lot. And just one small side note, the info@ccrren.org email is almost ready to go. So if you do have any questions in the meantime, the best way to reach us is actually ccrren@highsierraenergy.org, or you can also use the Contact Us portal on the ccrren.org website. That's an easy way to also reach out to us. And we are certainly interested in any feedback and input that you all may have as we are looking to schedule our next series of courses. So if there are topics that you would love to learn more about, or things, that we can help you with, please do let us know, reach out to us. we, yeah, absolutely enjoy your feedback. And then we will be sending out a short survey for folks to complete to just, capture any feedback and make sure that our trainings are as valuable as possible for you all. So with that, I think I'm all good. If there's anything else that we should cover, if anyone has any last questions, and thank you again all for joining us.
Sure. Any other questions or comments? We always appreciate good stories from either builders or plans examiners. If anybody has anything that they want to share or are concerned about, we're looking forward to in the CALGreen world. All right. I think we did it then. Thanks, everyone. We'll go ahead and sign off and look forward to seeing you at the next one. And we will send out the recording and the slides. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone.
All right.
Awesome.